Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture in the course. And here today, we continue our look at key developments in post-World War II America. Here today, we'll turn our attention to a key change in American politics after World War II, namely the rise of the modern conservative movement. In recent lectures, we've been talking about the 1960s as a time of dramatic change, civil rights, feminism, gay rights. Well, also in the 1960s, there's another movement developing, one that proves to be extremely consequential and influential in modern American history. We turn our attention to that other movement of the 1960s, the rise of the modern conservative movement and its impact in American politics since the end of World War II. One way to understand the modern conservative movement is as a backlash to the other social movements of the 1960s. During the 1960s, America is awash in a major social revolution. Civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam movement. But many Americans watching those trends, the greater assertiveness and visibility of racial minorities, women challenging gender ideologies, the modern gay rights movement and its differing attitudes about gender and sexuality, many Americans watching those trends and changes reacted with great alarm and fear that America was changing in a way that they found unnerving. And those Americans react to the social trends of this period by cleaving in a very conservative direction. So one way to understand the rise of the modern conservative movement is as a backlash to an America indeed awash in social change in the 1960s. Many were alarmed by the greater assertiveness of racial minorities, the challenges posed by the modern feminist movement and the modern gay rights movement, the anti-Vietnam protests. And Americans, unnerved, alarmed by those trends, do indeed cleave in this much more conservative direction. But it would be foolhardy to see the modern conservative movement solely as a reaction, a backlash to civil rights, feminism, gay rights, and the counterculture. Because the conservative movement itself was a grassroots movement that began here in the Southwest and Southern California, that sought to change America or preserve a vision of America in line with the values and interests of this group of Americans, conservatives. So it's another social movement emanating from the 1960s. Though the vision of political action and the vision of America advanced by conservatives is very different than the vision of political activism and of America advanced by civil rights activists, feminists, and other social movements of this period. Conservatives are themselves a social movement. They're not merely a reaction. They had a vision of America, and they too take to the streets, take to the ballot boxes in this period, and seek to orient America in line with their vision and values. So it's in part a backlash, but it's also best understood as a social movement in its own right, seeking to advance an image of America in line with their vision and values. Modern conservative movement began in the late 40s and early 50s as an anti-communist movement. It developed in that containment era, that early phase of the Cold War, as an effort by the Republican Party to reimagine itself prior to World War II, being the party of isolationism. In the 1930s, the Republican Party was the party of isolationism. It was the party that argued we don't need to worry about the rise of Hitler, the bellicosity of Japan. We've got two big bitchin' oceans to protect us. The problems of the world are not our problems. Well, that isolationist stance was discredited, revealed as foolhardy on December 7, 1941, with the attacks at Pearl Harbor. After World War II, the Republican Party sought to divest itself of its reputation as the isolationist party it was in the 20s and 30s and reimagine itself as the sober, serious, party on foreign affairs by adopting a very intense, hawkish, aggressive stand on the Cold War, that we needed more military spending, more intervention, more troops around the globe. So the modern conservative movement began as an anti-communist movement. It began as an effort to rebrand, reimagine the Republican Party as now the sober, serious party on foreign affairs. It advocated for more military intervention, more military spending, a more aggressive confrontation with the Soviet Union and communist China. But then in the 1960s, what began as an anti-communist effort branched out. And you have the three elements of the modern conservative movement. The modern conservative movement is often described as a stool with three legs, meaning that there are these three elements of the modern conservative movement that hold it up. The first of those three legs of the stool, the first of the three elements of the modern conservative movement, foreign policy conservatives. This is the origins, the beginning of the modern conservative movement as an anti-communist effort. Foreign policy conservatives are those who advocate for more aggressive conduct of American foreign policy, more intervention, more military spending. Foreign policy conservatives tend to argue for those policies of more American military might around the globe, more intervention, more military spending, more aggressive conduct of American foreign policy. Second leg of the stool, economic or fiscal conservatives, those who argue for rolling back the New Deal, the more interventionist role the federal government has played in the economy since the New Deal, less government spending, less government regulation, lower taxes. That's the second leg in the stool, fiscal or economic conservatives. And then the third leg in the stool, cultural conservatives, those who again are alarmed by civil rights, feminism, the sexual revolution, the rise of gay rights, and the efforts of gay and lesbian Americans for equality. In the 1960s, American culture is changing in the ways we've described in previous lectures, and many Americans were alarmed by those changes. And they formed this third leg of the stool, cultural conservatives, those who want to push against the changes advanced by feminism, gay rights, the sexual revolution, the more libertine values of that era. So what began as an anti-communist effort would branch out, include fiscal conservatives, who argued for rolling back the more interventionist role the government played in the economy since the New Deal, and cultural conservatives, so that by the 1960s, the conservative movement is this varying and expansive movement folding into it these different concerns among different Americans. A key event in the history of the modern conservative movement occurred in 1964 when the Republican Party nominated Barry Goldwater as their candidate for the presidency, their candidate for the White House. Barry Goldwater was a senator from Arizona, and his nickname was Mr. Conservative. So his nomination in 1964 really represents how in that year the Republican Party was now firmly becoming a conservative party. In the 1950s, the Republican Party wasn't yet a conservative party. It was still largely a moderate party. The standard bearer for the Republican Party in the 1950s was Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States for most of the 1950s. He was a Republican, but he was a moderate Republican. He inherited that New Deal tradition of government intervention in the economy, and he continued it. He signed into law in the 1950s the Interstate Highway Act that saw the federal government spend billions of dollars building the highway system we still rely upon. That sounds a lot like the New Deal, right? Massive government spending, putting people to work, building roads. As President Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican in the 1950s, helped to advance to some extent the civil rights effort by doing things like calling in the 101st Airborne to desegregate a public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. So the Republican Party of the 50s was a moderate party, but there was this jousting, this argument within the party among a group within the Republican Party, conservatives who wanted to pull their party in a more conservative direction. Well, in that jousting, in that civil war between the different factions, ultimately the conservatives prevailed because in 1964 they got their man, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, Mr. Conservative as now the nominee for the Republican Party, symbolizing how the Republican Party was no longer the party of Dwight Eisenhower, more moderate Republican, and now a conservative party. It's really, with the nomination of Goldwater in '64, the Republican Party was now solidifying itself as what it remains to this day, a conservative party. So 1964, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, was the nominee for the Republican Party. His nomination was supported by the growing conservative base of the party that was particularly here in the Southwest in places like San Diego, Orange County. His nomination was supported by suburbanites in those areas who often worked in the defense industry and owed their livelihood, therefore, to more government spending on military hardware. He enjoyed a lot of support from a rising evangelical movement, particularly here in the Southwest, in places like the Inland Empire, San Diego, Orange County, as part of the cultural conservatives that rallied around Goldwater. So his nomination represents the new conservative party, the new conservative coalition, and the way in which the Republican Party was now driven by that conservative grassroots effort. When Goldwater is nominated in 1964, he appeals to all three legs of that stool we described in the previous slide. He appeals to all three elements of the modern conservative movement. He appealed to foreign policy conservatives when he said, elect me and I'll advance a much more aggressive conduct of the confrontation with the Soviet Union and China, more aggressive conduct of the Cold War, more government spending on military hardware, more troops in Vietnam and around the globe. So Goldwater appealed to that faction, that element of the modern conservative movement. He appealed to fiscal conservatives because when he ran in '64, he promised to end Social Security, roll back one of the most successful, popular New Deal programs. We talked about the New Deal in a previous lecture. One hallmark of the New Deal was Social Security, established in 1935, where the government taxes some and redistributes that money in an effort to support those who can no longer work, the elderly, the disabled. Goldwater said, elect me and I'll get rid of Social Security. He campaigned in 1964 promising to abolish the graduated income tax. What's the graduated income tax? Well, it's the income tax we have, where as you go up, graduated income, you pay a higher rate. Well, Goldwater said rich people shouldn't pay more than poor people, and so he promised to abolish the graduated income tax, and in doing so, he appealed to those fiscal conservatives who said the New Deal's gone too far, that we should have lower taxes, particularly for the rich, less regulation. And Barry Goldwater appealed to cultural conservatives, those who were alarmed by changes in the 1960s, feminism, civil rights, because as senator from Arizona, he had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, you had a very clear choice when you cast your ballot for the presidency. You could vote for Lyndon Johnson, the liberal Democrat who had signed the Civil Rights Act into law, or you could vote for the Republican nominee, Barry Goldwater, who had voted against the Civil Rights Act. You don't get more stark, absolute in your choices than that. You don't get a clear opportunity to weigh in on the issue of civil rights. So Barry Goldwater appealed to these three different elements of the modern conservative coalition. Foreign policy conservatives with his promise for a more aggressive conduct of the Cold War, economic or fiscal conservatives with his promise to end Social Security, roll back Social Security, and abolish the graduate income tax, and cultural conservatives with his record as being opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, the conservatives got their man. They nominated Barry Goldwater, who represented this new conservative coalition comprised of these three elements, a new base of the Republican Party here in the Southwest, as he was a senator from Arizona. Supporters of the Republican Party who owed their livelihoods to working in the defense industry, the oil industry, the aerospace industry, so key to Cold War era. Despite all this, Goldwater would lose in a landslide, in part because he was represented by the Johnson campaign as an extremist, as someone dangerous, unhinged, particularly in his rhetoric in regards to confronting the Soviet Union, his call for a much more aggressive campaign against communism. There was a TV ad that ran in the 1964 presidential campaign just once. It's called the Daisy ad. It ran only once, but it ran once in primetime network television at a time in which most Americans only had 4 channels. In 1964, your TV only gets 4 channels. I know, so oppressive. How did they survive, right? And so though it only aired once, when you air a television spot in primetime TV on a network in 1964, tens of millions of people are going to see it. It's called the Daisy ad because it featured a cute little blonde girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, traipsing through a meadow of daisies. Beautiful, idyllic scene. This cute little girl in this field of daisies, daisies waving in the wind. And as she's walking through this field of daisies, she stops and picks one of the daisies and then begins to pluck the petals on that daisy flower. Again, beautiful, idyllic scene. And as you're immersed in this beautiful, idyllic scene of this cute little girl plucking daisies, then, as she's busily plucking these petals, in the background you see a mushroom cloud. Someone's dropped a nuclear bomb. And then it just says, vote Johnson in 64. That's it. That's the entire ad. But the message was very clear. If you vote for Barry Goldwater, that crazy guy is going to start a nuclear war. They're going to drop a nuclear bomb on your beautiful blonde daughter. So that's an example, the Daisy ad, of how the Johnson administration worked hard to represent Goldwater as dangerous, unhinged, the type of dangerous figure, extremist, who would start a nuclear war. As part of the effort to, as a product of, the effort to represent Goldwater as dangerous and extremist, again, Goldwater loses in a landslide. I think he only carried 3 of 50 states. And because of that, you might say, well, in 1964, you had this very clear, stark choice. You could vote for Lyndon Johnson, the liberal Democrat who signed the Civil Rights Act into law, or you could vote for the conservative Republican, Barry Goldwater. And America clearly chose the liberal Democrat. The conservatives had their moment. They nominated their man, Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, but they lost. And that, therefore, would mark a rebuke, a rejection of the conservative movement and its agenda. But if you just focus on the election of 1964, you miss the point. Because in the years going forward after Goldwater's defeat, the conservative movement would get stronger, not weaker, in ways we will soon describe. And just 4 years later, in the next presidential election of 1968, Richard Nixon, conservative, Republican from Orange County, will win the White House. And 4 years later, Nixon will be reelected 49 states to 1. We go from the election of 64, where the conservative Barry Goldwater is defeated, 47 states to 3. Just 8 years later, the entire electoral map reverses, so that Richard Nixon in 1972 is reelected 49 states to 1. Why does this happen? Well, between 64 and 72, you get civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the anti-Vietnam movement, and many Americans watching those developments cleaved in a conservative direction. So Goldwater gets the nomination. His nomination represents the triumph of the conservative movement and the way in which they now dominate and control the Republican Party. Goldwater loses, but in the years that follow, the conservative movement gets stronger. Goldwater was represented as an extremist, and here is a campaign button in which the Goldwater campaign embraced that idea of being an extremist. Here is a quote on the button where Goldwater admits to being an extremist. Here is a quote from the acceptance speech that he gave in 1964 at the Republican National Convention, where he accepted the nomination of that party and admitted to being an extremist. In this quote, he says, yeah, I'm an extremist in the defense of liberty. I mean, who doesn't want to be an extremist when it comes to liberty? Quote says, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, meaning you should never see being an extremist in defense of liberty as a bad thing. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is not a virtue. You should never be moderate when it comes to justice. A couple things here. One, look how presidential candidates spoke in 1964. They used words with more than just two syllables. I mean, think about our political culture today, which is so degraded, where politicians treat us like fools and idiots, where our political discourse is now hashed out on Twitter. In 1964, not that long ago, you had nominees like Barry Goldwater who used words like this in this fashion, treating us like adults. But the other thing to remark about this statement and the button here is that when Goldwater admitted to being an extremist, here, of course, again, an extremist in the defense of liberty, it made him very vulnerable to things like the Daisy ad, which represented him as a dangerous extremist who would bring us to the brink of a nuclear war. So Goldwater loses in 64, but as I've said now many, many times, and importantly to understand from this lecture, in the years that go forward after 64, the Republican Party and the conservative movement that controls that party gets stronger, not weaker. Goldwater loses in 64, but in the years that follow, the Republican Party and the conservative movement make major gains, and they do so in part through the conscious effort and employ of what's known as the Southern strategy. In the 60s and 1970s, the Republican Party would employ this strategy, the Southern strategy, in an effort to win over disaffected whites in the South who may have been lifelong Democrats. Now, prior to the 1960s, the South, the states of the old Confederacy, states like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, were known as the Solid South, solid in their support for the Democratic Party. This all goes back to the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, and so Southerners voted for the opposition party, the Democratic Party, since the Civil War. And that's why in the late 19th, early 20th century, states like Mississippi, Alabama were firm in their support for the Democratic Party. That's the Solid South, solid in their support for the Democratic Party. Well, today when we think of those states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, we think of them as red states, solid in their support for the Republican Party. We're going to have a presidential election later this year, and you can color in now states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana red because we know they're going to go for the Republican nominee. Well, that's the contemporary reality, and that contemporary reality begins in the 1960s where those states shift from being solid in their support for the Democratic Party to what they are today. Red states solid in support for the Republican Party. Now, part of this comes from the Democratic Party becoming the party of civil rights. In recent lectures, we talked about how in the 1960s, John Kennedy, a Northern Democrat, is trying to remake his party as the party of civil rights, where he comes out in support of the Civil Rights Act. It is a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who signs into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, also signed into law in 1965, that opened our borders anew, particularly to immigrants from Africa, Asia, Latin America. So in the 1960s, the Democratic Party is consciously and deliberately becoming the party of civil rights. And as a result, whites in the South who opposed civil rights could no longer support the Democratic Party. And at the same time, Republicans are reaching out to those disaffected whites through the Southern strategy and winning over those white voters to the Republican Party, turning those previously blue states into what they are today, red states. Now, the Southern strategy was an effort to appeal to whites in the South, win them over to the Republican Party, and it employed language that appealed to racial solidarities and often racism without overtly using racist rhetoric. By the late 60s, early 70s, it's no longer acceptable in American politics to be an overt, explicit racist. The last politician to get away with that was George Wallace, the governor from Alabama in the 60s, who openly campaigned as a segregationist. He's famous for saying, "I support segregation then in the past, segregation now in the present, and segregation forever going forward in the future." When you listen, if you must, I don't recommend this, but when you listen to the Lynyrd Skynyrd song Sweet Home Alabama, which improbably is so ubiquitous in America to this day, appearing in movies like Despicable Me, when they get to the point in that song where they say they support the governor, they're talking about George Wallace, who was governor of Alabama when that song came out, a governor who was an explicit racist who supported segregation. So the next time you hear that goddamn song, just turn it off because it's an ode to George Wallace in part. Wallace, though, was sort of the last American politician to get away with being an open racist and segregationist. As part of the Southern strategy, Republicans would appeal to whites in the South based on racism, race, and racial solidarities, but do so in veiled ways, in language that could make those appeals without being overtly racist, using rhetoric like law and order. Republican candidates, politicians in the 60s and 70s talk about being candidate law and order, party of law and order, which meant we want more cops on the streets, we want more aggressive enforcement, and longer prison sentences. So part of the Southern strategy was the emphasis on law and order. And what this was a way of appealing to race and racial solidarities without being overtly racist. When Nixon runs in 68, he says, I'm going to be the president of law and order. I'm going to put more cops on the streets. Well, what happens is that policy would disproportionately target racial minorities. Nixon famously launched the war on drugs in the 1960s, and that's been a great success, the war on drugs. We've won that one, right? Nobody does drugs in America today, yeah. War on drugs ostensibly was about more cops, longer prison sentences, combating lawlessness and disorder, but what it had in practice and reality was a racial element to it because the people targeted under the war on drugs disproportionately were racial minorities. And the people who were subject to those longer prison sentences were again racial minorities, and you had the advent of mass incarceration, the effort to lock up, in particular African American men, in what one scholar refers to as the new Jim Crow. What happens to Jim Crow when we end it in the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Well, it turns into mass incarceration where we lock up racial minorities. So on its surface, talk about law and order has nothing to do with race, right? More cops, longer prison sentence, but in practice, in reality, it was a way of implicating racial minorities as the problem, as the source of lawlessness and disorder. And enforcement, it tended to disproportionately target racial minorities. So that's a good example of the Southern strategy. Conservative politicians, as part of the Southern strategy, would talk about the evils of welfare. They would talk about how racial minorities were living large, cashing welfare checks, driving Cadillacs, while you, the white working class, were picking up the bill. Now again, on the surface, talking about the evils of welfare isn't ostensibly, explicitly about race. In fact, it might be seen as in line with conservative arguments for less government spending, again, those fiscal or economic conservatives, but in reality, it often had a racial element to it, where Ronald Reagan would talk about welfare queens in the 1970s, implying that, again, racial minorities are living large, cashing welfare checks, while white people are picking up the bill. There's a popular country song in the early 1970s called Welfare Cadillac that made that implying that racial minorities were driving Cadillacs very bald and very clear, that implication. So evils of welfare was a way of implying that, again, racial minorities are the ones benefiting from these programs, and that's venal and disgusting in two key ways. As we learned in our previous lecture on the New Deal, when aid for families of dependent children is first created in the 1930s, what later colloquially becomes known as welfare, it explicitly denied benefits to racial minorities. When aid for families of dependent children was created, what we call welfare in the 30s, it was for white people and white people only, as so many New Deal programs were. It was deliberately created to deny benefits to racial minorities. It's only until the 1960s with civil rights changes that racial minorities for the first time become able to receive welfare benefits, and then there's this deliberate effort to imply that they and only they are the ones receiving benefits. And that's also venal and disgusting because in the 60s, when that implication was being made, as is true today in the 21st century, the majority of people receiving welfare in this country are white. So talking about the evils of welfare and implying that's racial minorities who are enjoying welfare benefits is venal, ahistorical, and disgusting. But it became part of this Southern strategy where, again, on the surface, it has nothing to do with race, but it was really about appealing to racial solidarities. We learn in our study of civil rights that civil rights is a story of big government, federal government. It's about federal government intervening in a way, forcing states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. It's about federal action like Supreme Court rulings, Brown v. Board of Education, federal legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's about federal action in the form of Dwight Eisenhower calling in the 101st Airborne to desegregate Little Rock High School. And in response to that, the Southern strategy employed language like states' rights. The federal government should be telling you what to do. Freedom of association. You should decide who you want to hire. Now, again, on the surface, talking about states' rights, that's, federalism, that's the 10th Amendment, that's the idea of a separation, a division of powers. But in reality, because in the 1960s the federal government was active in the cause of civil rights, opening up opportunities for racial minorities, talking about states' rights and freedom of association had a racial element to it. So the Southern strategy was this effort to appeal to disaffected whites in the South who could no longer support the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was now the party of civil rights, win them over to the Republican Party, and do so in this veiled and oblique language that appealed to race, racial solidarities, and often racism without ostensibly and explicitly being racist. In 1980, Ronald Reagan would run for president, and he's Barry Goldwater all over again, with the exception that he actually wins. Ronald Reagan had been previously an actor in Hollywood. He had been the head of the Screen Actors Guild, the union representing members of Hollywood. He had been a New Deal Democrat. He supported Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s, but he, like many Americans after World War II, took a very conservative turn and enters politics. He eventually becomes elected governor of California in the 1960s. He introduced Barry Goldwater at that 1964 Republican convention where Goldwater would make that statement, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. So Reagan was this rising star in the Republican Party. He was steadfastly committed to the conservative movement and ideology. And in 1980, he launched a campaign to win the presidency and defeat the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter. And he kicked off his campaign by giving a speech in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, major American city, former capital of the United States? No. Ronald Reagan gave a speech as he ran for president in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a small little town, but a town that was the site in 1965 of the slaying of 3 civil rights workers, an event that later is acknowledged and commemorated in the book and film Mississippi Burning, and an event that, as we learned about in our lecture on civil rights, became very key and causal in building support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, demonstrating the ways in which the Klan and other white supremacist groups were willing to use terrorism, assassinations to prevent Americans from voting. So Philadelphia, Mississippi was the site of that murder of those civil rights workers. It was a small little town with not too many voters, but one that Reagan insisted on giving a speech in. He insisted on giving a speech in this little tiny town so associated with the Klan and racialized violence. It was seen then as an open nod to the Klan and white supremacy, and remains one of the black marks on Reagan's political career. But it also represents here a key aspect of this Southern strategy that is helping conservatives make major gains in the 1960s. So here's the meat, here's the evidence, here's the proof of what I've been stressing throughout this lecture, that yeah, Goldwater loses in 64, but in the years, decades following, the conservative movement gets stronger, not weaker. As that conservative movement builds, as more Americans become alarmed and troubled by civil rights, the greater assertiveness of racial minorities, the greater visibility of gays and lesbians in a period of the modern gay rights movement, as the anti-Vietnam protests swell and grow, as young people began to question authority, tune in, turn on, and drop out. As all those events are occurring, many Americans alarmed by those changes cleave in a conservative direction. as the Republican Party employs the Southern strategy and wins over whites in the South, their movement is growing, not ebbing, not shrinking. So Goldwater loses in 64, but in the years that follow, the conservative movement gets stronger, make major gains. Ronald Reagan is elected governor of California in 1966. And that really demonstrates what I'm stressing here now as we can weave together some different ways of thinking about the 1960s. 1960s California is at the epicenter of so many trends that we described so far that define this era. Civil rights. California is where Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are leading their efforts to unionize Latino and Asian American farm workers. California in the 60s is at the epicenter, the heart of the counterculture. You have the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, the Summer of Love concert here in San Francisco in 1967. It's a hotbed of the counterculture, the new American youth culture of the 60s. Rock and roll, Sunset Strip, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead. California is a hotbed of student activism with the SDS, so active on the campus of CSU and UC campuses. So by every measure, California in the 60s is that image of the 60s. Student activism, civil rights, feminism, the counterculture. But while all of that is happening, who's governor of California? Ronald Reagan, right? And you have this growing conservative movement in Orange County and San Diego, and this growing evangelical movement. And Robert Schuller opening the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County, appealing to evangelical, born-again Christians. So California is very demonstrative of what I'm now stressing, defines the 60s. And America heading in two very different directions, simultaneously becoming more liberal, more libertine, more transformed by civil rights, feminism, and also becoming more conservative. What's the story of the 1960s? It's a story in part of civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, all those trends we've talked about. But it's also the story of the modern conservative movement, which is making major gains in parts of the country that we often associate with civil rights, feminism, like California. A native Californian, born in Yorba Linda in 1968, wins the White House, Richard Nixon. And he launches that war on drugs, which tends to focus on minority communities and leads to that era of mass incarceration. Nixon wins in 68 and expands the bombing, trying to amplify the American war in Vietnam. So in the 1960s, while America is awash in civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, you have with it the rise of this conservative movement, making major gains. Ronald Reagan elected governor. Richard Nixon winning the White House in 68, and Nixon reelected in a landslide in 1972, 49 states to 1. So we go from the election of 64, where Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, is defeated in a landslide, to Richard Nixon, 8 years later, reelected 49 states to 1. Southern strategy, more Americans alarmed and troubled by civil rights, feminism, more Americans cleaving in a conservative direction, and the electoral gains are right there. So, as I indicated early, a big part of our story here today, the rise of the modern conservative movement, is the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. In 1980, Ronald Reagan would run for the presidency, challenging the incumbent sitting president, Jimmy Carter, and really run as Mr. Conservative 2, as Barry Goldwater, all over again. In his effort to win the White House, he openly employed that Southern strategy, kicking off his campaign by giving that speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He also appealed to Americans who were hungry for simpler times in many ways. He appealed to nostalgia. He talked about being born in a small town. He talked about the America of his youth. And that was very appealing to Americans in 1979, 1980, after 2 decades of dramatic change. You had in 1960s civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture. 1970s, the nation was shocked by a number of concussive developments. Watergate, the Watergate scandal, the revelation of the corruption of the Nixon administration. the loss in Vietnam, the United States, the most powerful nation in human history, being defeated by the efforts of the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. This was a great blow to American prestige that we lost in Vietnam, as America had to countenance its first major military defeat. Also in the 1970s, the economy changed. In the early 70s, that era of post-war expansion, which we've talked about in previous lectures, where people with a high school diploma could find a good-paying job, where it was easy to secure a house in the suburbs, a new car in the garage, that era of relative affluence in the 50s and 60s came to an abrupt end in the 1970s, with the beginnings of deindustrialization, decline in the industrial heart of the American economy as factories closed, moved overseas, with globalization, with now competition from abroad, with surging energy prices. Being the 1970s, the new economy, the economy we know today, that's very unstable, difficult for working class and middle class Americans, where wages are stagnant and the price of all that defines a middle class lifestyle is increasing. Housing, education, healthcare. That economy of today, the new economy, begins in the 1970s. And so America was traumatized by the loss in Vietnam, the scandal of Watergate, and a sense that the American dream was slipping away. And Reagan appealed with his promise of simpler times, of restoring an America that had been lost. And that was very appealing to Americans living in the harried, difficult times, the 1970s, and also the way in which he appealed through this nostalgia to an America prior to the 60s revolutions, prior to civil rights, prior to feminism. And so Reagan employed this heavy use of nostalgia, which was very appealing to Americans in the 1970s, where nostalgia was in vogue. 1970s, one of the most popular TV shows was titled Happy Days. It was an image of 1950s Milwaukee, prior to the 60s, prior to the changes of that period. If you watch Happy Days, it's an image of America that's for whites and whites only. There are very few, if any, racial minorities represented in that TV show of the 1970s that proved to be so popular. You had films like Grease. Again, a look at a 1950s America that proved to be popular in the 70s. So Reagan was really good at that. He was really good at tapping into that sense of alarm, unease. By the late 70s, after two decades of change, through a 1970s that saw a changing economy, that meant declining fortunes for the American middle class. And here comes Reagan, and he promises to, quote, make America great again. Yeah, he was the first to use that phrase. Trump stole it from Reagan. Reagan used that phrase as part of his appeal to an America that felt overwhelmed, troubled by the tumults of the 60s and the traumas and difficulties of the 1970s. So Reagan runs in 1980, and he appeals to Southerners with the Southern strategy. He uses the rhetoric and language of the modern conservative movement, talking about welfare cheats. He was the first to really develop that image of the welfare queen, this pernicious idea that racial minorities are the ones living large on welfare. He talked about law and order inheriting that war on drugs, and as president he would expand it. And he often appealed to cultural conservatives. When Reagan runs in 1980, he appears quite often on stage with Jerry Falwell, televangelist, who had founded the Moral Majority in 1979 to help Reagan win. He openly appealed to those evangelicals, cultural conservatives. Jerry Falwell, the televangelist, had no compunction, no restraint in intermingling religion and politics. And so Reagan talked about family values. He talked about an America, again, of a period prior to feminism, gay rights, and the sexual revolution. And all of this helps Reagan win the White House in 1980, defeating the incumbent president Jimmy Carter, launching what was described as the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's plan, once elected in 1980, for revitalizing the American economy, and as he would say, the American dream, was known as Reaganomics. Reaganomics was the economic policy platform of the Reagan administration. Reaganomics was the term that Reagan and his supporters used to describe their economic agenda for restarting, revitalizing the American economy. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, 1970s was a very difficult time for American consumers, workers. You had the beginning of deindustrialization, the shift in the American economy from an industrial economy where Americans work in factories and mass produce manufactured goods to what we have today, the service sector economy, where most Americans provide services. And that transition often had two sides to it. There's the high end of the service sector economy, accounting, law, medicine, where those people provide services. They don't make anything, no tangible goods. They provide a service. But because the service they provide requires a college degree, they're highly compensated. The other side of the service sector economy are low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs in home health care, in food service, fast food, in retail. And so as America transitioned to a service sector economy, many Americans found themselves on the underside of the American economy, working in low pay, low prestige jobs while factories closed, moved overseas. There's foreign competition increasingly in a global era. There were rising energy prices in the 1970s, which encouraged Americans to get rid of their big American-made sedans and get into smaller, more efficient Japanese cars, Toyotas and Hondas, only exacerbating the problems for the American auto industry. So the 70s was a time of great economic tumult and a sense of declining opportunities where American families felt their budgets increasingly squeezed. Reagan said, don't worry, I've got a plan to remedy that. Reaganomics. Reaganomics had three elements to it. One, lower taxes, particularly on the wealthiest Americans. Here, Reagan's argument was if we lower taxes on the rich, they'll have more money, they'll invest it, and that will grow the economy. When Reagan came in, the top marginal tax rate, top tax rate in America, was as high as 70%, meaning that when the wealthiest Americans made a certain amount of money beyond that, every dollar would be taxed at 70%. Not all their income is taxed at 70%. Once you get past a certain threshold, then every dollar that you make would be taxed at 70%. That was all designed to discourage people from taking home that much money and instead investing it in their companies, in their industries. So when Reagan comes in, we have very high tax rates. In fact, during the period that's often again described as the golden age of the American middle class, the 50s and 60s, where people again with a high school diploma could find a good paying job, turning bolts at the GM plant, buy a house, send their kids to college, we had very high tax rates. We had a high tax system. Reagan comes in and says, that's the problem. Rich people are being taxed too much. We got lower taxes, and he lowered it all the way down to 28 with the idea that if rich people have more money, well, that's good for everyone because they'll invest it, they'll open factories, a rising tide will lift all boats. So the first element of Reaganomics was lower taxes, particularly on the wealthiest Americans. Second element of Reaganomics was deregulation. He argued that environmental, workplace safety, consumer protection regulations have gone too far. They are too burdensome, too onerous on American corporations. We got to compete now with Germany, Japan, countries around the world. We got to get lean and mean. And so he orchestrated a number of efforts to roll back a lot of the environmental, workplace safety, consumer protections established in the 60s and 70s. 1960s was a time not just of civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the anti-Vietnam movement. It was also the beginning of the modern environmentalist movement, which would lead to the first Earth Day in 1970, and this year we acknowledged and celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So in the 60s and 70s, you had this environmentalist movement that led to the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Reagan says, that's gone too far. We got to roll that back. He also, as part of this effort to deregulate the stock and finance and banking industries, arguing, well, this will create more investment, this will free banks and other institutions to lend, and again, a rising tide will lift all boats. So the second element of Reaganomics was deregulation, particularly of the banking and finance industry, but also in an effort to roll back environmental, workplace safety, consumer protections, so that American corporations, in Reagan's argument, could better compete around the globe. Third element of Reaganomics was deunionization, rolling back, ebbing the power of unions. Again, in the heyday of the American middle class in the 50s and 60s, in that golden age of American capitalism, we had very high union membership. In the 50s, more than 50% of Americans were members of a union. Reagan comes in and works to lower union membership and union power, arguing that unions are now the problem, that they demand too much from corporations. They insist on, again, higher wages, pensions, benefits, and all that's bad as American corporations try to compete in an increasingly globalized economy. So Reagan would preside over a precipitous decline in union power. And that explains why today less than 5% of the American workforce is unionized. We've lost unions. After a period where they were strong, where in the 50s, more than half of the American workforce was unionized. There's an irony here to Reagan's efforts of deunionization. He was once the head of a union. As I mentioned earlier, he, in the 30s, was the head of SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, the union that represents people in Hollywood. Then he was a New Deal Democrat, a strong supporter of unions, even the head of a union. But as president, many decades later, he would argue unions are the problem. They're too bloated, they're too powerful, they're too divorced from the interest of workers, and so we've got to reduce their power. And one key incident in Reagan's first few months in office in 1981 symbolized this war against unions. In 1981, there was a strike by a labor union, PATCO, a labor union representing air traffic controllers. That's what the ATC you see on the screen here stands for in PATCO. PATCO was a labor union representing air traffic controllers. So PATCO, not Petco. Petco is where the pets go. PATCO was a labor union, and it represented air traffic controllers. That's the ATC here. Well, in 1981, they went on strike, demanding greater job security. Reagan declared the strike illegal, unconstitutional, a threat to national security. It was 1981. We're still in the Cold War. We still fear the Russians. And who's going to help the planes land if there aren't any air traffic controllers around? And as a result of declaring this strike illegal, Reagan summarily fired all the air traffic controllers who went on strike. They never worked as air traffic controllers again. They lost their livelihoods, their careers, and he crushed this union. It doesn't exist anymore. And that, of course, was the death blow to this union, but more importantly, doing this in the first few months of his presidency was a green light to corporate America, saying to them, look, if you get tough with your unions, you've got an ally in the White House. The PATCO strike symbolized that the Reagan administration, coming in now, was going to be an ally of corporate America in their efforts of deunionization, of rolling back the power of unions. So Reaganomics, Reagan's plan. Those who supported Reaganomics called it supply-side economics. The idea here was, for too long we focused on the demand side of the economy, the consumer. That's the New Deal, right? Put money in people's pockets, put people to work, that will help the economy. And through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we tended to have programs like that help people buy a car, get a loan, unionization that helped people, again, secure higher wages, grow the economy from the bottom up, demand side. Reagan said that's gone too far. And we've punished the supply side, the producers, the industrialists, the corporations, and now we need to have policies that are more in line with their interest. So if you supported Reaganomics, you called it supply side economics. Sounds very economics 101, right? Very clinical. Those who opposed Reaganomics called it trickle down economics because they argued all the benefits accrue to the people at the top and a few little scraps trickle down to the middle and working class and the poor. So how you felt about Reaganomics was clear in how you described Reaganomics. If you supported it, you called it supply-side economics. Arguing lower taxes on the rich, deregulation, deunionization will create an American renaissance. The economy will boom again. Again, what's good for the businessmen is good for us all. Those who opposed Reaganomics called it supply-side economics, arguing that this is all designed to benefit the rich at the expense of middle class, working class, and poor Americans. By the mid-'80s, there was a rebound in some sectors of the American economy, particularly those that had been deregulated by Reaganomics, namely the housing, banking, finance, and stock market industries. And with it came a new image of wealth in America. A new word entered the American vocabulary in the 1980s, yuppie. Yuppie, the YUP, stood for Young Urban Professional. And this was the new class, the nouveau rich, the new success stories in America. Young people living in urban areas who worked in service sector jobs like banking, finance, wheeling and dealing on Wall Street. And they were often glamorized, celebrated in the 1980s, in a period where, once again, American culture tends to worship the rich. 1980s, the term yuppie was everywhere, and it was now the model of success. It was a model of success, an image of the good life, success, but one for the few. Young, urban professionals, college graduates were living large, but the other side of the American economy was the rise of these service sector jobs that often locked people without a college degree into low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs in home health care, retail, fast food, the underside of the American economy that we've seen develop since the 1970s. And the split, this glamorization of yuppies and then the other America, was very visible in the 1980s in pop culture. 1980s, you had primetime soaps like Dallas and Dynasty that celebrated the super rich, these dishy soaps that drew you into the lives of the super rich, glamorizing the rich, urging you to spend your leisure time watching other people be rich. In 1980s, you had the beginning of reality TV, which today focuses on Real Housewives and Kardashians. But in the 80s, one of the very first examples of reality TV was this syndicated show hosted by Robin Leach, who just passed away not too long ago, called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. This show from the 80s really was prescient. It really points to what we have today in an age of Flip That House and the like. Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, the show in the 1980s, hosted by Robin Leach, brought you into the manor homes, mansions, vacation homes of the super rich, where you could gawk at all of their wealth, their huge bedrooms, their swimming pools. Behold, the golden toilet Donald Trump takes a crap in every day. And it was in the 1980s that a real estate developer from Queens became a household name, Donald Trump, with his best-selling book, The Art of the Deal, rocketing to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. So in the 80s, some parts of the economy rebounded, but they tended to be those service sector jobs, staffed by people with college degrees in urban areas, yuppies, and ultimately all of that was glamorized in Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, Dallas Dynasty, and the prominence of that real estate developer from Queens. But that other America, those who found themselves on the underside of the American dream, also somewhat less visible in American pop culture through sitcoms like Roseanne. Now, I know Roseanne has been canceled, right? Both literally and figuratively. It's hard to talk about any pop culture from the 80s now because so many people associated with the pop culture of the 80s have revealed themselves to be loathsome in so many ways, right? Roseanne with the racist tweets, Bill Cosby, Hulk Hogan, right? You can't talk about any pop culture figure of the 80s today, as they've all revealed themselves in different ways to be troublesome and loathsome. But before Roseanne was more associated with racist tweets, she had the most popular, at one point, TV show in America in the 80s and 90s. It was a story of deindustrialization. It was a story of the decline of the American middle and working class. In the sitcom, focusing on a working class family in the suburbs of Chicago, early on in the series, the character played by Roseanne loses her union job in an era of deunionization. And then for the rest of the series, she goes from one low-pay, no-prestige service sector job to another. So if you look at the pop culture of the 80s, you see this divided America that helps us understand in many ways the America we live in today. Reaganomics, the effort of Ronald Reagan to restore the American promise, but one that ultimately was uneven in its results and has led to a great divide that we see in America today in the 21st century between haves and have-nots. In 1992, it looked like this ascendance of the conservative movement that we've been detailing in the last few slides that begins in the 60s was about to come to an end. Because in 1992, a Democrat, Bill Clinton, was elected president of the United States. Ronald Reagan had won in 1980, defeating the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter. Reagan was reelected in a huge landslide victory in 84. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, was elected president. And so it looked like the Republicans had a monopoly, a control on the White House. But in 1992, that incumbent, George Herbert Walker Bush, was defeated in part because there was a third party candidate, Ross Perot, in 1992 that most believe took votes away from Bush, and that opened the door to Bill Clinton becoming president of the United States. So in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected, and many interpret that as a rebuke, a rejection of the Reagan Revolution. Many saw that as an opportunity for the Democrats to steer the country away from the conservative direction it had been since the era of Nixon. Today, Bill Clinton is still vilified by many conservatives as some sort of wild-eyed socialist type, some sort of liberal Democrat, some sort of pot-smoking hippie from the 60s who somehow became president. But that caricature of Clinton that still is advanced by some conservatives today just doesn't fit with reality. Because though Clinton was a Democrat, he stylized himself as a new Democrat. He famously said, "The era of big government is over." He said, "I'm not like those previous Democrats, Franklin Roosevelt, architect of the New Deal, Lyndon Johnson, president of the 60s, who helped advance civil rights and launch a war on poverty." Clinton said, "I'm a new Democrat," by which he meant he no longer supported that more interventionist role of the government in the economy, so that he would say the era of big government is over. He inherited Reaganomics and he continued it, lowering taxes, particularly for the rich. He presided over further deregulation, including the Glass-Steagall Act, that deregulated even further the banking and housing industry, and many see as causal in sparking the recession in 2008 that was an outgrowth of the deregulation of the banking and finance industry. He signed into law NAFTA, which accelerated deindustrialization, encouraging American corporations to relocate to Mexico, establish maquiladoras, where they could employ Mexican laborers who weren't unionized, pay them much lower wages to mass produce manufactured goods that had once been made here in the United States. In 1996, he signed into law welfare reform, what was known as the Welfare to Work Bill, that ended aid for families of dependent children. That welfare program that had been created under a different type of Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, during the New Deal. We talked about aid for families of dependent children. It was created in the New Deal during a time of spikes in starvation, infant mortality. It was rooted in that idea, we will not abide except starving children in the wealthiest nation on earth. When he was president, Clinton ended that program. And since 1996, the welfare burden has been transferred from the federal government to the states. And many states just don't have a welfare program today. The only states that really have one are California, New York, and Illinois. And even those states have very onerous burdens for securing those benefits. It was a Democrat who presided over that. It was a Democrat who ended that New Deal program, aid for families of dependent children. So Clinton today is often still caricatured as some sort of wild-eyed socialist by conservative media. It's the image you'll see of him on Fox News, but it just doesn't fit with reality. Because, yeah, Clinton was a Democrat, and he defeated the former vice president to Reagan, then President George Herbert Walker Bush, but Clinton came in and inherited Reaganomics and continued it. Further deregulation, further deunionization. And that's why today less than 5% of the American workforce is unionized. All of this came back to haunt Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary, when she ran for president in 2016 and was challenged by Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, a true liberal, said, look, when your husband was president, you signed into law NAFTA, welfare reform. Clinton also signed into law DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which was opposed to same-sex marriage. So Clinton, by no measure, was a liberal. He was, in many ways, a conservative, governing as a conservative, inheriting the Reagan Revolution and continuing it. And Bernie Sanders, of course, made that point, and that really undermined a lot of liberal support for Clinton and may have played a role in her defeat in the Electoral College in 2016. What's the end result of this? Well, again, the America we live in today, where this increasing divide between rich and poor, where we have seen this great cleavage between the wealthy and working class and middle class Americans who have found their wages stagnant, not growing, since the 70s. Adjusted for inflation, American working class families earn about what they did in the 70s, meaning, yeah, it's more in net dollars, but adjusted for inflation and buying power, if you're a working class American in 2020, you make what you made in the 70s, 50 years ago, and at the same time, all the things that define a middle class lifestyle, house, good health care, being able to send your kids to college, all those costs have skyrocketed. You guys are the meme generation. That's your wonderful contribution to American culture, right? You're always making these memes. Well, you've probably seen the meme Old Economy Steve, this image of a guy from a high school yearbook from the 70s with his big lapels and butt-cut hairdo. And the taglines attached to those memes say things like, well, I bought my first house when I was 23. Yeah, because in 1979, a house cost $30,000. That same house today costs $800,000 or $1 million. Those memes for Old Economy Steve say, well, I paid my way through college. Well, yeah, because it was $200 a semester in the 80s, right? So housing, education, healthcare, the things that define a middle-class lifestyle have become prohibitively expensive, particularly for working class and middle-class Americans who have seen their wages stagnant. At the same time, the wealthy have become even wealthier, this growing divide between haves and have-nots. In the 1960s, the ratio of CEO pay to the pay for someone in middle management, the average or median employee in a corporation, was about 25 to 1, meaning that the CEO, the chief executive officer, the head of a corporation, makes 25 times what the guy in middle management makes. And that makes sense, right? The CEO has the most responsibility, probably the most seniority, and so he's going to make a lot more than the guy in middle management. But by the end of the 20th century, that ratio of 25 to 1 had grown to 350 to 1, meaning the CEO makes 350 times a year what the guy in middle management makes. There's this period in American history known as the Gilded Age, where there's this divide between rich and poor, where robber barons and industry seem to get away with lawlessness and amass great wealth, while the poor find themselves slipping behind. In the late 19th century, you had that period known as the Gilded Age, a great disparity in wealth, rich and poor. Many people say that today America in the 21st century is living in a second or neo-Gilded Age, where once again we have this great divide between rich and poor, where the rich seem to control the political system and the legal system, steer it to their advantage, where the guilty are rewarded and the innocent are punished, and where we have a culture, like in the Gilded Age, where we worship the rich and spend our time fixated on materialism and markers of wealth, and readily apologize for the rich as if they are more fit and superior. That's a period in the late 19th century, and many see it as analogous to our America today, but that's a judgment you can now make after listening to this lecture and the lectures in this course.